Shirelle. Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Just a few, I can see a few people nodding. Yeah, so, well, thank you, Orange County CSP, for inviting me back. It's an absolute pleasure. I just love the idea that I'm zooming to California, you know, from London. And I only get a random number of people, like on my screen, like you all get a random number. We don't know who we're going to have. But amazingly, I know there are a few people likely here that I do know, but actually Carol in New York just happens to be on the screen that I can see, you know, which is random, everybody. It's random, it's not planned. But secondly, there's a chap called hi Carol. There's a chap called Cliff. He doesn't have his, I can't see his face, but I think the photograph he's using is Harry Potter's shopping trolley at King's Cross Station. So I don't know whether he's British or whether he's American or anywhere in the world for that matter, and he just loves Harry Potter. But it's quite interesting, the photographs that people choose to use instead of their own face, because it's a little bit of an insight into them. So Cliff, either you're British or a Harry Potter fan. I can see the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem as well. That's Arnold. So we're pretty global. So everybody, I'm going to have you made me co-host, Shirelle?
I'm doing that right now. Thank you. Absolutely. A lot of things happened in this one. One moment, I'm making you co-host so you can share. Sorry about that.
Don't worry.
And you are
all night, you've got all afternoon. Right, brilliant, thank you. Okay, so everybody, some of you, as Shirelle said, would have met me before. Some of you won't, but whoever you are, whether I've met you before or not, I'm still Rachel. I'll be the same whether I know you or not. So what I'm going to do, let's just get going. I'm going to share my screen, and here we go. Share. Oops, that's okay. Sorry, everybody. My computer was stolen a couple of weeks ago, just before I went away, and I'm still getting used to my new computer, because I had to buy this brand new computer, and the software is sort of, I thought it was going to be more or less the same as my previous computer, but it's a new version of Apple, and so I'm still getting used to it. So forgive me. So is everybody ready? Hoover, I can see you. Can you hear me and see me on my screen? Fantastic. So some of you might have been to some of the other presentations I did for Orange County, and some of you might not. I think the glory of what I do for myself is that whatever I'm talking about, and whether it's Jewish or women or East End or West End or Hackney or whatever, food, cinema, whatever, what I really, really love about everything that I do is that ultimately it all tends to link up. And so the idea is, the more that people hear me and walk with me, if they're in London, is that gradually you get this massive jigsaw of London. And sometimes you'll do something and you'll think, you know what? Actually, Rachel, didn't we hear about that on another talk or another walk? And rather than think of it as repetition, I think of it as linking, and this just beyond gorgeous jigsaw of London. So for your purposes, I've been concentrating on Jewish London. And a couple of the things, the reason I'm saying this is that a couple of the things that I might mention this evening for me, lunchtime for you, late evening in Israel, is that some of you might think, haven't I heard that before? And a few of the things you might have done. One of the other things to bear in mind is you don't have to take notes. I'll be mentioning quite a number of books and films and authors and things like that. There's no need to scribble it all down, because I've got a handout. Some of you might have received this handout before. We sent out this handout from the same handout from a previous talk I did for CSP. But it actually is a handout that links to this. So some of you will have it and some of you won't, but it will have all the names of the films and authors for you to sort of follow up afterwards. So without further ado, I'm going to do a little introduction to Jewish London, the book, basically to just lead you in. We're starting a little bit late, but I hope you're all sitting comfortably, because I'll be talking for about an hour, just under an hour. But I think you're all used to the way I natter on. So on we go. So Jewish London by Rachel Kolsky and my friend Rosalind Rawson. This is the kind of thing that people said about it. And you know what? If authors can't tell you what amazing reviews you get, who is going to say it? So these are the kind of things that people said. I think one of the things I really like is I can't stop reading it. It's not often that a guidebook gets people genuinely excited, but the stunning Jewish London sets standards that are hard to beat. So authors would kill for something like that. It's quite a complex book. It covers all over London. London isn't just the old Jewish East End, it's North London, Central London, the City of London. And also it covers a lot of the kind of cultural and heritage elements, museums. A lot of them are quite unknown in London, actually, but for those of you that visit London regularly, there might be a couple of things that you think, you know what, we've done that and we've done that, but we haven't done that yet. So it will give you a chance to do something a bit new. Obviously, it's got walking tours. I rely on people booking me for walking tours, but not everybody. We can't always find a date that suits. So sometimes people want to do their own self-guided tour linked to the routes that we've put together. Nothing wrong with that at all. And we also cover areas where people live, so the Jewish neighborhoods, which typically aren't that exciting. Actually, St. John's Wood but also people who go and visit people for simchas, weddings, bar mitzvahs. Sometimes they want to know where there's a hotel they want to stay, and we've included all of that kind of stuff in the book as well. We've done a number of what I call features. This is a good example, the Czech Memorial Scrolls Museum. That's only open by appointment, but if anybody comes to London and you haven't yet been, it actually is absolutely fascinating, the whole story behind it. And indeed, it wouldn't surprise me if some of the shuls that you're members of around the United States might have a scroll from this collection. It's one of the museums that prided itself on becoming smaller as it gives away its collection of scrolls to synagogues that need a scroll around the world. And of course, bagels. I think I've done Jewish food for Orange County. So anyway, smoked salmon and cream cheese bagels, can't beat them. But one of the features that I really wanted in the book was a feature about Jewish London on film and Jewish London in books on the page. And I thought the reason I really wanted that is because I'm passionate about film and cinema, and I also read quite a lot. And for people that can't get to London, actually seeing Jewish London through film or through books is a brilliant way of doing it. So within the book Jewish London are two features, one about books and one about films. And so when we were launching Jewish London, actually at Jewish Book Week. Actually, it was a long time ago. It was 10 years ago. It's 10 years ago this month, although it's now in its third edition. It's been updated a couple of times. I was given free rein on how I wanted to launch Jewish London to the public, and I decided that I would do it as Jewish London on location, Jewish London on film and in books, because that's basically my particular interest. So here's a montage I put together of film posters, one, and book covers, and a couple of theatre programs as well. And it gives you an insight actually into the variety of Jewish Londons there are that you can visit through film and on book. And as you look at these, I don't know what you're thinking as you're looking at these titles. I don't know whether you're thinking, oh yeah, read that, seen that, been there, done that, or whether you're thinking, gracious me, I haven't heard of any of these, or goodness me, don't they look interesting? I really want to know more. I hope it's the latter, because that's basically the crux of the talk that's coming along. But I think most of these are going to be covered in my talk, but not all of them. Basically, time just doesn't allow. But the glory of these books, really, the books I've chosen and the books and films I've chosen, with a couple of exceptions, are ones that I absolutely love, and I typically go back to time and time again for lots of different reasons. I have also included at least one film which I don't like at all, but I think that it's important that you know that it exists. And as you'll see, and the other thing to bear in mind is that some of them are fiction, some of them are non-fiction, and and the non-fiction books I've chosen are very, very readable. And so what I'm also hoping is that you'll come away thinking, not to sort of disregard a book that's on the bookshelf because it's in the non-fiction section, because you'd rather read a novel. Some non-fiction is incredibly well written and quite inspirational. So let's get going. So we're going to start with this gentleman. This is a sort of a drawing of a very famous writer, a British writer called Israel Zangwill. He was known as the Jewish Dickens because he was a bit later than Dickens, but he was around in the late 19th century into the 20th century. And the reason he was called the Jewish Dickens is that he wrote in a style quite similar to Dickens, in the sense that he wrote about what he saw around him, very much sort of social observation. And that's obviously, some of you might not have read Dickens, but some of you haven't read him, you might have seen films of his books or serializations. And Israel Zangwill, he also, like Dickens, used to go and read what he was writing to the masses, because obviously not everybody could read in those days. So he mirrored Dickens in that way as well. And the most famous book that he wrote was Children of the Ghetto. And he wrote this in 1892, and you can see here that this is sort of a verbal rendition of it. By the time he wrote Children of the Ghetto, he was in 1892. He was already quite well known. He was very, very bright. He was educated in the Jewish East End at the Jews Free School, and then he became a teacher there, and then he became a journalist. I should also say that after he wrote Children of the Ghetto, he published a play called The Melting Pot. And The Melting Pot was from the early 20th century. And what's interesting there, that story was about immigration into the United States. And I saw a production of it a few years ago, and it was prefaced with the rarely produced, The Melting Pot. And when you go to see a play where you're told it's rarely produced, there's usually a reason why it's rarely produced. It was not very good, but I think but it's important, if nothing else, for sort of introducing that term, the melting pot, which we tend to link to America and immigration rather than Britain and immigration. Anyway, Children of the Ghetto, he published in 1892, and it's about the Jewish East End, sort of in and around Whitechapel, Spitalfields, Brick Lane. And what's very, very important about this book, there's a couple of things. Firstly, this is really the best evocation that we have of the Jewish East End of the late 19th century, because at that time, most people who lived in the Jewish East End were too busy earning a living to actually start writing about what their lives were like. And Israel Zangwill, the central family within Children of the Ghetto, was the Ansel family, which was based on himself, and all the other characters, whether it was the rabbi, whether it was the shopkeeper, whether it was the shmerel, whether it was the radical trade unionist, all the characters were based on real people. And there are people that have done a lot of research into Children of the Ghetto to match up the characters in the book with the real people of the time. Obviously, the names had been changed. And he deals, and the other thing that's very important is that it's very much a book about the Jewish East End for the non-Jewish public, in the sense, these were known as aliens, the foreign, the exotic, and a lot of the way the Jewish people lived was a little bit totally misunderstandable by the public at large. And so when you read Children of the Ghetto, it's sort of a little bit of what I would call a manual into the Jewish life cycle. So it covers all the kind of things that Jewish people would be going through. So birth, bar mitzvah, weddings, death, periods of mourning, and also the time cycle of the Jewish calendar. So the Shabbat every week, but also the Chagim during the year. So it's just, like I say, like a do-it-yourself manual. And in fact, there was a glossary included at the back with sort of what the terminology meant for the non-Jewish readers. And it was a big seller, and it was a top seller. And again, what was interesting about that is that for the impoverished people of the Jewish East End, typically the immigrants from Russia and Poland, they had this best-selling book written about them, and this is really quite amazing for them. It gave them a sense of pride in many ways. I should also say about Israel Zangwill, for me, he's a big star, because he was very supportive of rights of women and very supportive of the Votes for Women campaign. So he was a member of the Men's League for Women's Suffrage and the Jewish League for Women's Suffrage as well. And he was very supportive of Sylvia Pankhurst, who was my favourite member of the Pankhurst family. So he fired on lots and lots of cylinders and was well regarded within the Jewish and the non-Jewish community. Now, within Children of the Ghetto, he talks about the soup kitchen, and this is the soup kitchen that he would have known. So again, when you read the book and you know a little bit about the Jewish East End, you get a feel for for what was going on. The soup kitchen for the Jewish poor was founded in 1854, so well before that massive influx of immigration from Russia and Poland. And it started in one building, then it moved to another building. And in 1892, this was the building that Israel Zangwill would have known as the soup kitchen. And see, this is a very typical depiction of it. And what I love about his writing is that he's very evocative. I mean, it's very, very descriptive. And he talks about the women being one weird and witch-like, with their shawls around their shoulders and their scarves around their heads. And he talked about the men being stunted, swarthy, and strange. He really, quite gruesome in the descriptions. But then what he did was, when he described these men as strange, swarthy, and stunted, he then said, but their faces were illuminated with black twinkly eyes. And so the way I look at it is that he tells it as it is, with all the misery, but then he makes sure that people's humanity is brought back. So this is the soup kitchen that he would have known when it was in Fashion Street. And then, of course, and by the time of the 1890s, the Jewish East End was swelling with all the immigrants coming in from Russia and Poland, and so they needed to build a new soup kitchen. And if you want to pay homage to the soup kitchen in the Jewish East End, this is where you'll go. So this was built, you can see from the date, in 1902. And the building, I think, is it's one of my favourite buildings. It was funded by the very rich for the very poor, but they still made it look good. It was none of this, it's the soup kitchen for the very, very poor. We don't have to make it look good. You've got good quality building materials at ground level, or what you would call, in America, you call that first floor. You've got soup kitchen for the Jewish poor in a beautiful font, way out, way in. You've got the Hebrew and the Christian, or the secular year, and you've got a tureen of soup above the doorway in the porch, because not everybody would speak English. A lot of them were speaking Yiddish. And so the tureen of soup said, this is where you'll come to get your soup. The first and second floors, that is the second and third floors, the people in the States, were the kitchens for the soup were on the ground floor in the dining room. And then the next two floors up were rented out as workshops, typically for the tailoring trade, and that meant that the charity would get some rent, and then the rent they got in from the workshops, would then perpetuate the charity. Then at the very top, which you can't see in the picture, there was rooms for a girls' youth club. So the idea of the talk very much is to talk about what you can see on film and read in books, but where you can go and see links to that in London. So that's the idea. Or just enjoy the books and the films for that matter. It stayed as a soup kitchen until the 1980s, when the building was sold off, and the front is listed. I think in America you have a National Heritage Monuments Fund grouping, something like that. But basically, we call our buildings listed. That is, they're protected, and so the front is protected. But what they've done is rejig it behind, and it's now flats and offices behind. But it is one of my favourite. And I know when I do walking tours in the East End, like this is the moment where people get their camera out. Everybody thinks this is the photograph we're going to take. So Israel Zangwill and Children of the Ghetto. And linked to the soup kitchen, we lead into chicken soup. And this is a cover of a programme when I went to see this version of Arnold Wesker's Chicken Soup with Barley at the Tricycle Theatre in Kilburn. The theatre is now called The Kiln. And Arnold Wesker, later Sir Arnold Wesker, he died just a couple of years ago. Arnold Wesker was born in Hackney, but he spent some of his formative years in the in the Jewish East End. He wanted to be an actor, but he didn't really make the grade. He had a lot of chips on hhis shoulder, did Arnold Wesker. And actually, in the end, he wrote a play called Chips with Everything, but that was about working in a kitchen. And he wrote very, very personally Arnold Wesker, and Chicken Soup with Barley is a very personal play. And it begins in the Jewish East End in an attic flat, very much based on the flat that he lived in Fashion Street in the East End with his family, and then it's on the day of the Battle of Cable Street on October the 4th, 1936. Chicken Soup with Barley. I mean, Arnold Wesker went on to write other books. I'm talking about Jerusalem and Roots. That's known as his key trilogy, and they're very much about the immigrant experience. And Chicken Soup with Barley in particular is very much based on a family experience where you have the immigrants coming in, and then you have the children being born in the new country, in this case, England, living in London. And it's how your hopes and aspirations can be dashed. And also it very much tackles the difference between assimilation and integration. So I'm sure some of you have discussed that at great length in other meetings that you've had. Some people see Chicken Soup with Barley and get really, really angry. I went to see this production with a friend, and at the end, I'm sitting, I think it's a very powerful play, and this was a particularly good production. I'm sitting there at the end, absolutely exhausted with the emotion of it all. And oh my God, I'm sitting here slumped, not unable to get out of my seat. And my friend says, oh my God, she says, let's just go. She says, what a ridiculous family. Why did they just carry on talking about things? Why didn't they just get up and do something? Why didn't they do something? Why didn't they get a job? And it was like, it was quite interesting how two different people could see the play in two different ways. And Arnold Wesker himself divided the community. I think not the Jewish community. People were divided about him. He was very prickly. He wasn't an easy person. As I said, how he wrote was very, very personal. And he did rub a lot of people up the wrong way, particularly the establishment. But his heart was in the right place, and he was very, very passionate about making the arts freely available to everybody, and he did a lot of work to make sure that it didn't matter where you came from, what your income was like, what your background was like. Art, literature, theatre should be made available to you. And I used to hear him speak. He used to come back to the Jewish East End quite regularly, and I used to really love going to listen to him speak and do the readings when he would read from his one-act plays. He was very good at writing about female characters. Not every playwright and writer can do that, but I felt he was very good at that, and I had a soft spot for him. I thought he was rather super, but like I say, not everybody agrees with me. But this is Chicken Soup with Barley, the key event within that play. And this was the 4th of October, 1936, the Battle of Cable Street. Very, 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 very famous in London's history. Across the globe, it might not be so famous, but this was very much people power taking over. So basically, in the 1930s, we had the British Union of Fascists, established by Oswald Mosley. And in 1936, he decided he was going to march his troops through the Jewish East End, and he was doing it to be antagonistic. And the idea was they were going to walk from Tower Hill near the Tower of London to a victory parade at Victoria Park, and they were going to walk through the Jewish East End deliberately to be antagonistic. The Jewish elite and establishment, like the Board of Deputies, the Jewish Chronicle, they all said to the Jewish community, stay at home. Don't make a fuss. Let him walk through. Don't rise to the bait. But the Jewish population of the East End basically said, no way. We are not going to let him and his troops walk through our patch. And what was interesting is that in collective memory, people always think that when the police came out, that the battle was between the Jewish community and the fascists, but it actually wasn't like that. The police came out in force to allow the fascists to walk through the Jewish East End. And what actually happened was the Jewish community sort of gathered, gathered together, gathered support from the local dockers, who were typically Irish and Catholic, and the communists. The communists are actually going to have a meeting in Trafalgar Square that day, but actually they came to help out in the East End. And so the police came to help the fascists walk through. And so the battle was actually between the Jewish community with the dockers and the communists against the police. So really, it wasn't like people think of it at all. And in the event, the fascists had to turn tail, and it was everybody else that marched to Victoria Park for that victory parade. That's a very brief resume, by the way. People write books and PhDs about the Battle of Cable Street, but that's a very brief resume of it, and this gives you an idea. And there were huge barricades about it, and there were poems and there's songs. But for me, Chicken Soup with Barley is the piece I will always go back to if I want to relive the Battle of Cable Street in my mind. If you want to go and see sort of something that represents the Battle of Cable Street in London, I do entreat you to go to Cable Street itself. So I'm standing on Cable Street taking this photograph. Cable Street was the southern boundary of the Jewish East End, if you like. Below Cable Street was the London Docks. So that really was, as I said, more Irish and Catholic as and everything else for that matter, but not so Jewish. And anyway, this was a bomb site. There was a building there until the Second World War, and that was knocked down, destroyed during the Blitz. And in the 1970s, this magnificent mural was painted depicting the Battle of Cable Street, and it's absolutely wonderful. You can see you just get the energy. You just get the energy of it. You get the barricades, the mattresses, the chairs. You've got the police. If you look over to the right-hand side, you should see a man in underwear. Can you see, in white underwear and green socks, right over to the right? And if you look closely, you can see that's Hitler. And so Hitler is lampooned within it. And below Hitler, if you see a man in a black uniform with a black cap, that's Oswald Mosley. I mean, a very good looking, a fine figure of a man. I mean, he wasn't very pleasant, but he always looked good, and his troops wore black shirts, and they look good. There are people throwing marbles. So that was the Jewish people at the East End throwing marbles under the feet of the horses of the police. You know, it was violent. There was a lot of violence at the Battle of Cable Street. Sadly, practically everybody that was at the Battle of Cable Street is now died, or if they haven't died, they're very, very old. But I met a number of them, and they were already senior. And one of them said to me, "This mural is not correct. This mural is not correct." He goes, "There's somebody throwing an egg." He said, "Nobody would throw an egg. That was food. People in the Jewish East End wouldn't have thrown food away." It's very fascinating. Everybody brings different experiences to look at things, and it's always fascinating for me what people see and what people comment on, and it's anyway, so there you have it. Anyway,
Rachel, I'm interrupting you for one moment just because there's a request if you can talk a little more slowly, just like
more slowly. Do you know how much I've got to get through? I'm looking at my watch here.
I'm getting a request.
I'm joking. Yeah, I know. I do talk fast, but gosh, there's always so much to fit in. I'll try and talk a little slowly. Sorry, everybody. Do you know what? I just get so excited. And there's so much to say. And don't forget, I always talk about Rachel, slowly. I always talk about my favorite things, and you can't help but get excited about your favorite things. But I'll try and talk slowly. What's next? Oh, this is a mural by the same artist who completed it. This is in Dalston, and the reason I've included it is because Dalston was also a very Jewish area, and we'll be coming back to Dalston a little bit later in Hackney in North London. But if you look at the top, can you see where it says nuclear free zone? Can everybody see? A Hoover. I keep seeing a Hoover. Can you nod? Can you see nuclear free zone? Lovely, thank you. And above nuclear free zone are some red and orange brick buildings. Can you see the orange and red brick buildings? They're blocks of flats that were built by the 4% Industrial Dwellings Company, which was a Rothschild initiative to provide affordable housing for Jewish for Jewish families, and they get a mention a bit later as well. So you see how everything just merges together. Oh, and there's a detail. Oh, there you are. Look, I forgot, I put a detail in. So there you have it. Those 3 blocks of flats, they're in Dalston, 4% industrial dwellings buildings. Now, still in the East End though, East End Jewish Radicals, 1875 to 1914. I've included this book. It's an academic book. There's not many pictures in it. It's just pages and pages of thin paper with lots and lots of writing on it. But it's by William Fishman, better known as Bill Fishman. And this book is very important for a couple of reasons. One, it's an academic book, but it is so readable, you will not want to put it down. And the other thing is that Bill Fishman, he was an East Ender, born and bred. He was at the Battle of Cable Street as a teenager. He became a teacher, an educator, visiting professor in a university in America, but devoted most of his time at Queen Mary College History in East London. But Bill Fishman was the man who in the 1970s and early 80s began taking people on walking tours of the Jewish East End. Now, you might not think that's anything special, but in the 1970s to the early 1980s, that was when the Jewish East End was being depopulated by Jewish people. This is when the East End was miserable and down at heel, whether you were Jewish or not. It was just the place. Nobody wanted to work there. Nobody wanted to live there. Nobody wanted to go there. But Bill Fishman took people on walking tours. I mean, I was at school and at college. I wasn't going. I only met him much later on as an adult. He took people on walking tours in the East End, and he basically said to everybody, look at these buildings. I mean, so much of what he was showing people has since gone, but look at these buildings. And he told people the stories, human stories behind those buildings, which is like my tagline, human stories behind the buildings. And if you find people like me and other walking tour guides of East London, if they're of a certain age, like my age, I would imagine that they were inspired by Bill Fishman, as indeed I was. And I was really excited when I first met him. Well, I met him a number of times, and a really, really special man. And this book is about East End Jewish radicals, so revolutionaries, trade unionists, and he just brings them to life and makes them so accessible. And it was through his book, East End Jewish Radicals, that I met my favorite anarchist of the East End. Now, in this photograph, you can see 4 men. The one second in from the left, he's got his arm on a lady's shoulder. That is Rudolf Rocker. And I met Rudolf Rocker through Bill Fishman. Now, Rudolf Rocker wasn't Jewish. He was an anarchist. He had to leave Europe. To cut a very long story short, he ended up in the East End, the Jewish East End in 1895. And he just got an affinity. He just felt a connection with the Jewish workers. And he, despite not being Jewish, learned Yiddish. He ended up editing the Yiddish newspapers like Arbeiter Freund, Die Zeit, Germinal. And he also encouraged Jewish workers to become unionized. He encouraged them to go on strike. He encouraged them to support non-Jewish workers when they went on strike. If the West End tailors were on strike, he said the East End tailors should go on strike and support, in support, collaboration. Really a very, very special man. And he lived, because he was an anarchist, he lived in free union with a Jewish lady called Millie Whitcomb, and that's the lady whose shoulder he's got his arm on. And what's again fascinating, Millie Whitcomb, Jewish, came over. She had 3 sisters. Her parents came over from Russia. She worked as a seamstress and earned the money to bring her parents over. 3 of these 4 girls lived in free union with non-Jewish anarchists. I mean, can you imagine what those poor parents thought? And the one daughter who married a Jewish man went off to America. So they were stuck with their 3 anarchist sons-in-law. But everybody loved Rudolf Rocker. And again, to cut a long story short, he was invited to America. 1897, he and Millie went off on the ship, got to Ellis Island. They'd gone on the ship as Mr. and Mrs., because you sort of had to play the game, didn't you, really? When they got to Ellis Island, they were asked for their marriage certificate. And they said, well, we don't have one. And the woman at Ellis Island said, what? You don't have a marriage certificate? She said to Millie, well, you know, how will you keep a man's love without a marriage certificate? And Millie responded, you know, how can a piece of paper keep a man's love? And the woman said, but if everybody acted like that, we would have free love. And Millie said, well, without it being, you know, when love isn't free, it's prostitution. And Ellis Island said, out you go, back to England you go. So I'm afraid, America, your loss was our gain. So thank you ever so much for that. And as I said, most of what I said that he got up to was obviously after they'd been sent back from America. And if you want to pay homage to Rudolph Rocker and Millie Whitcott for that matter, you can go to Dunstan House in Stepney Green. The block of flats was built in 1899. They lived in flat number 33. But there is a curious PS to the story. He was German. And at the outbreak of the First World War, the police went to their flat here at Dunstan House, and he was arrested and interned as an enemy alien. And he never returned to that flat. He was interned in 3 different places during the First World War. And after the end of the war, he was deported and never returned. But I'd love to see a plaque on that building. Well, soon, actually. I'd like to see a plaque there soon in honour of Rudolph Rocker and Millie Whitcott. So my favourite anarchist. And thank you, Bill. Around the corner to Dunstan House, where Millie and Rudolph lived, is Cressy House, where her sister Polly lived with Ernst Simmerling. And Cressy House, lots of Jewish people lived there. But the reason I'm mentioning it in this talk is because it was used as a film location for a film called Vera Drake. Now, Vera Drake isn't a Jewish film, but the director was Jewish. So Mike Lee. Jewish from Manchester. Nice middle-class background. He was a member of Habonim, so a little bit Zionist when he was young, but he doesn't live a very Jewish life. He married a non-Jewish, had a non-Jewish wife. And interesting when you think about Jewish playwrights or Jewish directors, film directors, you know, are their works linked to the Jewish community and their Jewish heritage or not? And what's interesting about Mike Lee is he doesn't really do anything Jewish at all, although he's very Jewish if you actually go and hear him speak. But anyway, Vera Drake was about backstreet abortions, illegal abortions in the 1950s. It's a very depressing film. People who knew about midwifery in the 1950s are very divided on the film, but it's quite evocative in many ways of the 1950s. And I mentioned the 4% Industrial Dwellings Company before, the flats in Hackney in North London. Well, at the other end of Stepney Green, to the block of flats where Rudolph Rocker lived, is this block of flats. And this was a 4% industrial dwellings block dating from 1896. And this is the oldest surviving example of the 4% dwellings. So it's still rented accommodation, although the number of flats, there's a fewer flats because the flats have had to be enlarged because of rules and regulations about living space. But in Stepney Green, the whole area was very, very Jewish from the late 19th century into the up to around the Second World War, and then there was rapid depopulation. Lots of famous Jewish people had their childhood within these flats, but the gentleman I want to mention is Bernard Copps. And Bernard Copps, still alive, bless him, is in his 90s. He's like a national treasure. And he had his childhood here in his home. But where did he spend a lot of his childhood? Well, he spent his childhood, a lot of it, well, he went to school, but a lot of his childhood he spent in the Whitechapel Library. So the photograph I've just put up in the building over to the right-hand side was opened in 1892 as the Whitechapel Library, a public library, but it was funded by non-Jewish people, inspired basically the initiative of the vicar and his wife, the local vicar and his wife, Samuel and Henrietta Barnett. But it became known as the University of the Ghetto because so many Jewish people went there to study, to get away from their cramped homes, to debate, to meet their future husband or wife. And lots of famous Jewish artists and writers spent their formative years there. It opened on a Sunday in deference to the Jewish community. Now, Bernard Copps, who spent a lot of time there, in the book Jewish London, when we were writing about the library, Bernard Copps wrote for me what is one of my favorite poems ever. And he wrote it about the library. And don't forget, I'm a librarian. And this poem to me captures what libraries are all about. And I fell in love with libraries when I was a child. I still can't walk past a library without going in, but as a child, I almost lived in my local library. And we wrote to Bernard Copps when we put together the book. And I said, I'd really like to include your poem, Whitechapel Library, Aldgate East, which he wrote because the library was being closed. And I haven't got time to read it to you. You can find it on the web, or you can find it on page 49 in Jewish London. There you are. That's a very blatant plug for me. But it's a beautiful, beautiful poem, basically about how having access to the best of world literature was the passport away from the Jewish East End into a worlds that you could only dream of. And, you know, for anybody who's gone to other worlds through literature, that poem will speak to you. A newer book, and perhaps a book that isn't so well known, is a book by Patricia Friedberg, which was published in 2010. I was introduced to Patricia through somebody I'd met, through somebody. And just at the time she was publishing her book. And what I love about this book is that it's a novel, but it's based on truth, the characters and the places. So it's called 21 Aldgate, which was the family home of Patricia's family in the East End, but it was actually 21 Whitechapel High Street. So when you read the book, there's no such address as 21 Aldgate. So when you read the book and you see the descriptions of the places, if you know the East End, you'll think, that's not what? But then it will all piece together and you realise that it's Whitechapel High Street she's talking about. And if you don't know the area, I'm telling you, as it were. But what's interesting about this book is it's a triumvirate, it's a triangle of areas in London. So basically the story is Clara. She works from, I think, a firm of solicitors. One day, she just felt they were being a bit anti-Semitic on the run up to the Second World War. And she said, you know what, I'm leaving. And she left, had no job, no money, nothing. Oh my God. Through a chance meeting with a friend in a cafe, she is given the chance to work for an artist called Paul Mars. Paul Mars is a real artist. If you don't know his work, seek it out. Fantastic. Beautiful work. I love it. And he needed help on writing his book, A Frenchman in Khaki. So he lived in Chelsea. So what you have is Clara, who was born and brought up in the East End, suddenly going over to the upper middle class aristocratic Chelsea, Second World War, a little bit of anti-Semitism. So she's straddling two worlds. And then the family home is blitzed during the Second World War, and they go and are relocated to a suburb in North London, Woodside Park. So what you actually have in this book is a love story. You have the story of the Second World War, Winston Churchill, resistance work, how Clara gets involved. And you also get a very interesting story of a Jewish family who moved from the East End to a North London suburb. So I think it works on lots and lots of angles. And in fact, ever since I've known the book, and I was given a copy at the time it was published, they've been trying to make it into a film. I think it's going to make a really good film. So look out for the book and look out for the film. And still in the East End now, let's come to a film. This is one of the quintessential films about the Jewish East End, A Kid for Two Farthings. This is a stage set, but you know, The Kid for Two Farthings, by the way, is not a good film. It's not a good film at all, but it is a film that everybody should see because there's a difference. You know, I say there are some films people should see. They're not good, but you should still see them. So this is a stage set evoking Petticoat Lane, the street market. And A Kid for Two Farthings was written by Wolf Mankiewicz. Wolf Mankiewicz born and brought up in the East End. He then went to Downing College, Cambridge. He became more English than the English, but he was a very prolific writer, and a lot of his books, he wrote novellas and books, were made into shows and films. He became very renowned for his knowledge of Wedgwood China. He opened up an antique shop in St. James's, just off in Piccadilly in London, and that's why this is Make Me an Offer. You can see Make Me an Offer. That's about the antique trade. And A Kid for Two Farthings was made into a film. It was the book was 1953. The film was, I think, 1955. And it's got Diana Dawes in it, and it's about a little boy who's got a one-eared goat, but he's told by the tailor, Mr. Kandinsky, that it's a unicorn. I mean, oh, please. It's so whimsical, it's painful, but you do actually get some brilliant notions of the East End of the 1950s, post-Second World War. And you are reminded that while the area was very Jewish, the Jewish community lived side by side with the non-Jewish community. This film are the two different communities living side by side, and how they integrate as well. No health and safety. This is the little boy who had the goat going in and asking if he can use the Hoffman presser. If you did that today, you would be arrested for child cruelty. But in the 1950s, I think we allowed a notion of a little bit of common sense. Now, if you want a book about the tailoring trade and the East End, read Jew Boy. This book, very, very underknown. It was only reissued a few years ago. The title is uncomfortable. Only a Jewish person would call a book Jew Boy. Published in the 1930s. So you go back in time, the interwar years. This book is brilliant. It covers what it was like to be young and Jewish in the East End in the 1930s. It was hard work. He evokes the tailoring trade, and as you read it, I mean, honestly, if you read it, the rhythm of the tailoring, the sewing machines, you get the rhythm, and the fact of, you know, the pace of the work and the sweated labor and the orders coming in and the orders having to be fulfilled. I'm talking quickly because it was fast. The work was fast. How are you going to get the work? When the time and motion men came in, the pressure to get the things out, the stuff was made in the grotty East End, and then it was pressed and taken over to Savile Row, you know, for the upmarket clientele. But also it shows you what life was like. Life was fun. Life was vibrant. These young people depicted in this book, they want to go to clubs, they will go to folk clubs, they go to debating clubs, they go to the countryside on their bicycles on their days off. They're not necessarily religious. Religion doesn't really come into their world at all, you know, like what we think about being observant Jewish people, but they are quintessentially Jewish, and their lives are so full. Again, I very underread Jew Boy, but I implore people to read it. And other things are depicted in the East End on film. And this is a picture of Hessel Street, which was a street market known primarily for chickens and poultry meat in Whitechapel. And the gentleman I want to mention here is Robert Vash. Robert Vash was born in Hungary in 1931. He lived in the Ghetto during the Second World War. He survived, but he left Hungary in 1956 at the time of the Hungary uprising with his wife, and he was already a filmmaker. And the first film he made when he came over to England was called Refuge England. It's a short film. You can find it for free on the internet. I loved this film. I love that look of that man, Tibor. Oh, he wasn't a professional actor, but look at that face. This film is about Tibor. He comes over from Hungary, and all he has is a piece of paper with an address. He speaks no English whatsoever. And the film is about how do you find that address when you don't speak English and the address isn't a full address. It's absolutely stunning. Anyway, that made Robert Vash's a reputation. And then he got funding to make a film about Hessel Street, which he heard was being demolished. And so what he did, this is like 1962 or 1963, he went along to Hessel Street in the East End, and he took a microphone and he took a camera, and he just filmed the street. He just filmed, you know, the man, the proprietor of the menswear shop. He filmed the chicken plucker with the fag hanging out of his mouth, you know, throwing ash all over the chicken. He filmed the market where you see these Orthodox Jewish men alongside the exotic fruits that were now coming in with the new demographic as the Jewish community was leaving. You know, the new demographic from the Caribbean were coming in. And it's only about half an hour, the film. If you go, this film is so important because literally, if you go to Hessel Street today, none of this exists. So that 30-minute film really captured the dying days of something that was very important to the Jewish East End. A book called Rudinsky's Room in the Jewish East End tells a very different story. It tells a story of this synagogue. The synagogue was built over the back garden of a house in Spitalfields. You can see a long, thin synagogue, a very small, poverty-stricken synagogue. Anyway, it closed in 1963, got locked up. In 1983, the building was bought by a housing trust. They went in, they found the synagogue intact, but covered with dust and cobwebs. And upstairs, they found a room lived in. It was squalor. It's squalor. And to cut a very long story short, they wrote articles about the room and the man, who was called David Rudinsky, but nobody knew why the room had just been left. Anyway, some years later, in 1991, Rachel Lichtenstein came along. Her grandparents had been married at the shul, and she found that David Rudinsky had died a few weeks before she was born. And she decided she would then follow up the story. And so she wrote the book Rudinsky's Room with Ian Sinclair, another writer, about the synagogue, about the history of the synagogue, about the East End of the area, the street, and also about the gentleman David Rudinsky. What happened to him? Why did he leave? And for a lot of people, this building really captures the essence of the East End. It captures the spirit of the East End, this small and poverty-stricken synagogue, but also the story of David Rudinsky, who lived in the attic for many years before he had to leave. You've got to read the book to find out the rest of the story. The delightful film called The 10th Man, made in 2006, will take up 15 minutes of your life. Don't please Google it now, but after the end of the talk, and when Shirelle has sent you the link to the this, that, and the other, again, I implore you to watch this as well. Oh, you're going to be busy. This film I have watched how many times? A million zillion at least. And it's 15 minutes. It's based on a true story about Yom Kippur, Kol Nidre night, when a shul in the East End needed the 10th man. And the 10th man comes, and then he gets chapped. He gets taken away to another shul that needs the 10th man. And if you look in the middle picture, you can see Monty's wearing the tallit, Monty being chapped, taken away from one shul to the other. And when you watch the film, if you've been to the Jewish East End, you'll recognize a lot of the places. And if you haven't been to the Jewish East End, you will visit the East End through the film. So you've got the men at the top, then Monty being chapped, and at the bottom, one of the film locations, Fieldgate Street Synagogue with the mosque behind. So this was one of the film locations. This photograph is one of my favorite photos because it was taken just at the time the Jewish East End was changing from being Jewish to Muslim. But this is the star of the film, Sandys Row Synagogue, which you'll see in the film. And inside, beautiful synagogue built as a Huguenot Protestant chapel in 1766, became a synagogue in 1869, and it's been a synagogue ever since. But this is the star of the film, a synagogue that's still going today, just. On the edge of the city and the East End, we're now going to move away from the city, from the East End. And this is the Kindertransport Memorial. I'm sure many of you know the story of the Kindertransport. This memorial at Liverpool Street Station was made by Frank Meisler, who a lot of you will know as an Israeli artist, but he actually came over to Britain on the Kindertransport, age 10, from Danzig, and then made Aliyah, I think, around 1960. But most people consider him to be Israeli. But anyway, he beyond talented, and this memorial is one of my favorite memorials in London, because it really tells the story. And what you had here for Kindertransport is a film and a book, where you had the film Into the Arms of Strangers. This is a still from it, about the story of the Kinder who were given refuge in Britain without their parents. And then the year 2000, and then the book was made out of the film, and it's a very simple book in the sense that it's just one story after the other of different the Kinder, but from my experience listening to stories of survivors and people who came over on the Kindertransport, their stories are all the more powerful the simpler they tell. They tend to tell their stories in a very simple way, which tends to make it, for me, all the more powerful. So the film and the book, again, both worth catching. An area that's very, very Jewish today, the hub of the ultra-Orthodox Haredi community, is Stamford Hill. And Stamford Hill is in North London, in Hackney. And this is sort of a parade of shops. It looks exactly the same today. Beautiful late 19th century shops. And the film I want to mention here for you to see is The Barber of Stamford Hill. It comes from a play by Ronald Harwood, who was actually born Ronald Horowitz, South African playwright, changed his name to Harwood. This film is a relatively short film. It makes me cry. I get emotional just thinking about it. This film is about Mr. Fig. Mr. Fig is the barber, and he has his barber shop in Stamford Hill. He's played by John Bennett, and he lives alone in Whitechapel. And the story is about the fact that he lives in Whitechapel, and every day he gets on the 67 bus and goes up to Stamford Hill, where he meets his clients. And he talks to his clients because he's a barber, and he asks his clients about their children, their wife, the bar mitzvahs, the weddings, the simchas, the sorrows. And they say, "And how are you, Mr. Fig? How's the wife and everything?" And he says, "Thank you, everything's fine." But he doesn't have a wife. He lives alone in a rented house, home, flat. And his only friend is Doba, who's a mute, who's deaf and dumb. And I don't know, it's so poignant. And but despite the fact that he lives alone and he's very lonely and he makes up stories about his life, he keeps Shabbat and he lights his own candles. And it's a really, really beautiful little film about friendship and about loneliness, but never losing your faith at the same time. And again, when you watch the film, if you know Stamford Hill and you know Whitechapel, you'll be able to spot some of the film locations. You can actually reenact the journey on the 67 bus if you so wish, even today. And still in Hackney, the quintessential.
I'm interrupting you again for one moment, just to mention for people who are asking that we'll be sending all the references, and to allow you to continue. And I hope we'll open up also for a few questions soon. I'm just checking in with you because the time is.
I know, well, we started a bit late.
I know.
I get the hint. It's okay. Got it.
No, we're here as long as you're.
I'll keep going. No, I'll do it quicker. This is the quintessential book about Jewish Hackney. The point about Hackney. Oh, Rachel, just get on with it. This book, from the moment you start reading it, from the opening stanza, you're hooked. The hero is Harry Boy Boaz. He's a gambler. It's based in Hackney. And again, what you've got, and Hackney, in Jewish London, in the 1950s, there was nearly as many Jewish people in Hackney as there were in the Jewish East End at the height of the Jewish East End. So Hackney is incredibly important for the Jewish journey in London, but was forgotten for many decades. Anyway, again, the protagonist is Harry Boy Boaz. He's a gambler. He's Jewish. Every so often he works as a presser. And the book was written by Alexander Barron, who was Jewish, born in Reading, but brought up in Hackney. And Harry Boy Boaz lives in Ingram Terrace which was based on Fulden Road, which was where Alexander Barron lived as a child and a young man. So you can actually do a tour called Alexander Barron's Hackney, and I walk around Hackney, just linking Hackney, places in Hackney, to Alexander Barron's books. But again, what's interesting about the Lowlife is that it's triangular. Harry Boy lives in Hackney, so you've got all the stuff about Hackney. But his sister, Debbie, has married a bookmaker and lives in Finchley, a northwest London Jewish suburb. And Harry Boy goes to the Jewish East End to spiel, to gamble with the new immigrants in the East End, the new Asian immigrants. So when you read this book, not only do you get a feel for Jewish Hackney after the Second World War, when things were changing very rapidly, you've also got this very interesting triangle of the aspirational Jewish people that have gone to the suburbs and the change of the Jewish East End to the Bengali East End. Alexander Barron, my favorite author of the 20th century. Let's go to Soho. A lot of people know Soho because when they come to London, they go to the theatre and they go to the cinema and they stay in hotels in the West End and they go and eat. And so here you have it, Ronnie Scott's, Ronald Schatt, Jewish boy from Cable Street, Jazz Club, Frothy Coffee, Denmark Street, rock and roll. And there's two very important films linked to Jewish Soho. The Jewish West End was a very important Jewish area as well, a sort of story in its own right. And I'm going to mention Espresso Bongo. Espresso Bongo is a terrible film. It's almost unwatchable. It was a show written by Wolf Mankiewicz, the aforementioned Wolf Mankiewicz, and it's about a venal agent who discovers a bongo player and turns him into a star, you know. But it's about the venality of agents and the music industry in Soho. Lawrence Harvey, who I adore, Jewish, so I can adore him. God, he was terrible in this. God, he was terrible. But it's an interesting film because it captures the essence of the music industry in the 1950s. The film dates from the early 60s. The late 50s, early 60s, and it captures the energy of that period and the Jewish input into the entertainment. This is the film you should all watch. I am evangelical about this film. Evangelical. Everybody must go and watch this film. It is available on DVD and available on the internet sometimes. The Small World of Sammy Lee takes place in Soho. Anthony Newley, who lots of people think is Jewish or was Jewish, but he wasn't Jewish. He had a Jewish grandmother, but boy, did he seem Jewish. He's so gorgeous in this film, it hurts really. And he is on screen almost the whole time, and he is running the whole time. The energy of this film is phenomenal, and you are exhausted at the end of it. But again, what is special about this film? Well, the story basically is Anthony Newley is a host of a seedy striptease club, and he hates it. And he's a gambler, and he owes a mob some money. And the film is all about how is he going to get the £300 to pay off his debt. Otherwise, it's not going to be pretty. And then there's a love interest as well. And again, the film captures the essence of two very different Londons. The West End, the Soho, the Windmill Theatre, Revue de Ville, the snooker clubs, the gambling, the sleaze and the ickiness. So that's the pictures I put up. But you've also got the East End. Why do you go to the East End in this film? Sammy Lee, he has a brother, Lou Lehman. Sammy was Lehman, but he's cut his name in half, so it's not so Jewish. Sammy Lee, Lou Lehman. What is brilliant about this film is that half the film is in Soho, some of the films in the East End, some of it's filmed on location, and some of it's filmed on in a studio. So what you've got at the top are two stills from location in the Jewish East End. This is Wentworth Street. If you go to Wentworth Street today, it's still instantly recognizable, despite the fact they're trying to renovate everything so that we don't think it looks like the East End anymore. And at the bottom, you've got Lou Lehman's delicatessen. Sammy goes to his brother Lou played by Warren Mitchell. Warren Mitchell, very underrated actor. And the bottom right-hand picture is a still from one of my favorite scenes ever in the whole history of film. I can almost reenact this scene for you word for word. Anthony Newley goes to ask for some money from Lou Lehman. These are two brothers, and the older brother says, "What are you doing?" You know, he knows Sammy's in trouble. Then what happens? In walks Lou's wife, the shrew, played by Miriam Carlin. And Miriam Carlin, the wife, can't bear Sammy. And you have this scene with these three characters and the love and the pathos and the hate, all the emotions you can think of coming off the screen in one 5-minute scene. It's worth seeing the film just for this. But trust me, it's a wonderful, wonderful film, and it captures two very different Jewish Londons. The northwest London, Belsize Park, going back again to the refugees of the Second World War. Eva Ibbotson came over from Vienna as an 8-year-old, lived in Belsize Park with her parents before they split up. And as an adult, she wrote a number of books for children and for adults. And The Morning Gift is a wonderful book. It's written for teenagers, actually, but actually I read it as an adult and absolutely loved it. And I met Eva Ibbotson's daughter, and she said, "You know what, this business about whether books are written for teenagers or adults, just forget about it. You know, it's a brilliant book, read it," which is exactly what I did. And this book is ostensibly a love story, but it captures the essence of the immigrants, the refugees from Nazi Europe, and how they made a whole new community for themselves in Belsize Park and Swiss Cottage. And they all meet in a cafe called the Willow Cafe, which was based on a real restaurant that refugees went to in that area called the Cosmo, Cosmopolitan, later called the Cosmo. So the Cosmo is now an ice cream parlor, but a lot of us remember going there, and even in the late 70s, early 80s, when I first started going, so I was a little bit late to it, they were still only eating schnitzel and red cabbage and Dobosch Torte with Schlagsahne, you know, and everybody spoke with German accents and Austrian accents. And but when you read The Morning Gift, if you know this area of London, Belsize Park, Swiss Cottage, the streets and the atmosphere really jumps out of the pages for you. And so important was that Cosmo restaurant that the Association of Jewish Refugees has actually put a plaque outside it as a reminder of how important it was. Eva Ibbotson, by the way, as an aside, even if you're not interested in The Morning Gift, read her books. Her books are beyond brilliant. If you've never read them, please do start reading them. She's absolutely stunning writing. This is a still from a film called Sunday Bloody Sunday, 1971, by John Schlesinger. John Schlesinger, Jewish and homosexual, and he was an outsider on 2 counts, as it was in those days, Jewish and in many ways, and being homosexual. And this is a very interesting film because there's a homosexual doctor who's also Jewish and who struggles with his sexuality and his faith. The reason I'm showing you this clip is because he, in the in the film, he goes to his nephew's bar mitzvah, and this film is filmed in a synagogue that's used a lot for films. The bottom shots are from a film called Susie Gold, but this is the synagogue. The synagogue is New London Synagogue. It was originally St. John's Wood Synagogue. It's on Abbey Road, and it was built in 1882, but it's famous for being the only synagogue in the world where all 4 Beatles attended a service. And the reason all 4 Beatles attended a service at this synagogue was because the memorial service for Brian Epstein, their manager, who died tragically young, was held here. But I thought I'd put it in for that very important scene. And John Schlesinger, of course, his films always very different, but always, in my humble estimation, always excellent. I think he was a great filmmaker, John Schlesinger. He always did films about people on the outside, you know, Sunday Bloody Sunday, what do you call it? Midnight Cowboys, and another good example of his work. And I'm going to end. You'll be pleased to know this is my last film. Again, I'm evangelical about this film. It Always Rains on Sunday, 1947, post-Second World War, directed by Robert Hamer. Now, this film takes place in Bethnal Green, a relatively Jewish area. Although it wasn't filmed in Bethnal Green, it was filmed in Camden Town for the purists who need to know these things. And what I want to point out to you is something very important. An Ealing Studios production. Ealing Studios is typically known for Ealing comedies, but it's a Michael Balkan production. Can you see that? It Always Rains on Sunday, a Michael Balkan production. Michael Balkan was Jewish, and what was amazing about Michael Balkan was that he understood about making a British film industry, and he made these films which were quintessentially English. You know, fascinating, but it's another topic, and I've given you that talk. But look at the names of the film stars they put on the poster: Googie Withers, Jack Warner, John McCullum. They're all the Jewish. Rachel, stop that. They're all the non-Jewish actors. But so this film poster gives you no indication of what the film was about, and about how the film captures the essence, again, predating A Kid and Two Farthings, of the Jewish East End, where you have the Jewish community living side by side with the non-Jewish community. That from the Jewish point of view is what makes this film so fascinating. So the love story is Googie Withers, who is married to a widower, and her ex-lover comes back. He was in prison, John McCullum here, Tommy Flowers, and he was in prison and he escapes, and he comes to the household, and Googie Withers is stuck between her boring husband and the bitchy stepdaughters who she can't bear, and her lover who comes back, who needs her to help him. So that's the love story bit. But for the Jewish bit, what you've got is the Hyams family. And the Hyams family and the Sandygate family are totally integrated. And Meir Zelnicka, who was very important in Yiddish theatre, plays Mr. Hyams, the daddy figure. And then he's got his two sons, Maury and Lou. And Maury and Lou are both womanizers. Maury's married, but he's going out with he's got a non-Jewish mistress. And Lou, the brother, is going out with Vi, one of the stepdaughters of Googie Withers' character Rose. So you can see how the Jewish and the non-Jewish characters are sort of integrating their lives. There's Sidney Taffler. This Sidney Taffler was in Britain one of the most famous and much loved Jewish actors, and this was his screen debut as Maury. He ran a record shop, and you can see he was a musician as well. And he has one of the best lines in the film. So he's married to a Jewish woman, but he's having an affair with a non-Jewish woman, and she knows it. And one day his wife comes into the shop, and she comes in and says hi, and then she goes out, and she says, "I'm just going out." And he goes, "Where are you going?" And she says, "I'm going out to get some air." And then she turns to him and says, "Don't worry, I'll get it wholesale." And it's just this Jewish humor just pervade. This film is really about the non-Jewish world in Bethnal Green, but how the Jewish humor just pervades it. Really quite amazing. And Lou wants to leave Bethnal Green. He wants to leave the East End. And no, sorry, the father wants to leave the East End, and Lou says, "Well, where do you want us to go, Dad?" And he goes, "Let's go to Stamford Hill." And Lou says, "Nah." It's quite interesting, because obviously, retrospectively, that ultimately everybody goes up to Stamford Hill. And so I want to end on this with this film, because for me, it's not a Jewish film per se, but for me, it captures very much the essence of the Jewish East End immediately post Second World War. So there you have it, everybody. Oh, there you go. So you've got Maury there with his wife. She's just out to go and get some Mayor wholesale. You've got Mayor Zelnicka, the dad. You've got Lou there in the top right-hand corner, played by John Slater, who sadly died very, very young. And then in the top left-hand corner, you've got the three ne'er-do-wells, and over in the far left, you've got Alfie Bass, who was in a lot of British films, and he was born Abraham Basilinsky, and then he became Alfie Bass. So again, when you watch this film, you've got Alfie Bass, John Slater, Maya Zelnicka, and Sidney Taffler. You know, what more can I offer you, everybody? That's British theatre and film and TV in one film, plus a bit of Jewish London. So thank you for inviting me back. Thank you for coming, and thank you everybody for the films. There's your montage. Don't forget, everybody, if you want to keep in touch with me, just email me, info@GoLondonTours, and you can join all my groups or Zoom with me across the world. Oh, and off I've gone. Oh, I clicked my email. I clicked my email instead of clicking next. I just wanted to, the next slide was, thank you for coming, everybody. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Rachel, for an amazing talk. For those of you who are still with us, I'll just first of all say that we'll be sending you an email with all these references that I'm sure, I myself want to just crawl into bed with all these books and films and dive into all these fascinating references, and we'll be sending them to you so you can do that too. I've opened the chat to everyone so you can post and we'll all see it. And Rachel, if you do have a few minutes just to answer questions, and if that's okay with you, so there were a few, and people can also post them in the chat, even though we're slightly beyond time. But if you have a few more minutes, we'd love to have you for a while longer. Is that okay?
Yeah, I'm not very good at answering questions. I prefer to know just what people's comments and whatever, you know. So let's see how it goes. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe just one thing that came up. I'm just looking at a couple of questions that were written in the chat a little earlier. Was about the feelings of the Brits when there was an onslaught of Jewish immigrants arriving in the 1930s, and it's just interesting to hear what it was like then, when nowadays we're all dealing with these questions of refugees. So if you have,
oh my God, that's nothing to do with Jewish London on Location. I mean, that's a totally different. I mean, gosh, that opens the floodgate. I mean, that's a whole different story. I mean, I can't answer that in 1 minute. No, sorry. It's a really interesting thing, but it's also a little bit controversial. Life was very different then. There was no welfare state, and the Jewish immigrants that came over in the 1930s were helped purely by the Jewish community.
Yeah, and I will ask, there was a moment you mentioned about wanting to have a plaque on one of the buildings, and I'm wondering how much of kind of are there plaques in these places in London? Is there kind of a way to find them, or is this kind of something that...
Well, funny you should mention that. I am passionate about plaques, and in fact I have a Zoom talk called Round, Blue and Jewish, where I actually do a talk about plaques to Jewish people and Jewish connections around London. No pressure, everybody, no pressure. But if you do want to know about plaques, I'm your girl. Yeah, so that's a massive question.
No, it's a good, but I'm happy.
People talk about plaques, they talk about the official blue plaques, but actually there are lots of other organizations that put up plaques. As far as I'm concerned, every building should have a plaque, because every building, something must have happened. Somebody's been born, died, worked, lived, discovered something. And, you know, and plaques give you an insight into what's happened, you know, behind those walls. The official blue plaques, you've got to be dead before you can have an official blue plaque. And the building of the plaque has to still be standing, i.e. the building where you were born, where you died, where you lived, where you worked has to stand. Whereas other plaque organizations, a plaque might be put up on the site of something, or it doesn't happen that often, but occasionally the person might still be alive, you know, like Michael Caine. He's not Jewish, I know that, but it's a good example. Michael Caine is still alive. Well, he was when I last looked. And his birthplace has a plaque. So there are lots of different organizations, local authorities, public campaigns to get plaques. Last year I went to a plaque unveiling to Mark Bolan, who I was in love with as a teenager. Mark Bolan, you know, the pop star. So yeah, I don't know if that really answers anybody's question, whoever answered it, but yeah, lots of plaques, lots of organizations, lots of different colors, lots of different shapes. Yeah.
So I'm happy for that question because it also revealed another session we might have with you. So that's a good one.
And aren't I? Yeah.
I want to thank you again. We'll obviously share your information, the recording of this session, and all the amazing references for books and movies. Thank you, everyone, for joining us and for being patient with the slightly bumpy beginning. And we hope to see you in our upcoming events.
Thank you, Sherelle. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody. At OC, even though and beyond, like across America and across the world. Keep well, everybody. Keep well, because we're pretty much back to normal, but not totally. So be alert, but keep well. Yeah, and safe journeys if you're going anywhere. And Hag Sameach for Pesach, because Purim's over. We can now mention the other P word. And so Hag Sameach in advance for Pesach, maybe first Seder in real life for a good few years, isn't it? For many people, it'll be our first. We've had 2 Zoom Seders. Well, I know not everybody has Zoom Seders, but we had 2 Zoom Seders, and now we're going to have in real life again. So,
so thank you. Have a good day and a good afternoon and a good evening and good night, depending on where you are. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Bye.